Well, for our third segment together, we're going to look at the gospel in suffering in the book of Lamentations. A short little book of 5 chapters with such wonderful gospel comfort in the middle of the middle chapter. The faithfulness of God, His mercy new every morning. And yet, on either side of that golden verse in the middle of the book, on either side of it, there is deep pain. And what strikes me the most about the book of Lamentations is that it is very honest, very transparent about the fact that the suffering of God's people was due to their own sin. And it helps me repent of my own sin when I acknowledge that not all of my suffering, but some of my suffering in life is because of my own sin. And yet, even though that's the case, God doesn't reject me forever. And there is hope even for people who realize that they have wasted their life. So that's the book of Lamentations. You know, we are so worried about being Job's 3 friends, assuming that anyone in pain is suffering the consequences of their own sin, afraid of saying something insensitive, unhelpful, and unbiblical, that we forget that the Bible gives us more than just one explanation of suffering. True, suffering can be mysterious. Not everyone who is suffering is being punished. God disciplines those whom He loves. Pain is not always payback. But we also need to remember that sometimes we actually do suffer because of our sin. And this calls for pastoral wisdom. If we see that our parishioner has lost his job and his marriage and is forbidden to see his children, and we are able to connect the dots between those losses in his life and the fact that he is an alcoholic, what do we do then? Is that the end of the story for us? Do we just shun the man and withhold sympathy? Because after all, he's just getting what he deserves? Is it ever appropriate to grieve with someone who is suffering because of their own sin? Absolutely it is. If the book of Job explores the mystery of the innocent suffering servant, Lamentations explores the misery of getting what we deserve. Jeremiah, the likely author of Lamentations, he was not himself guilty of most of the sins of Judah. And yet, he threw himself into sincere grief on behalf of his fallen city. He mourns with those who mourn, even if the tragedy is due to their sin. He acknowledges the guilt that got them there. And by empathizing with these saints who are simultaneously sinners, Jeremiah is able to show us the depth of the gospel. If he had kept himself far away, safe from their pain, we would be missing out on the depth of the gospel. And so Jeremiah models for us how we as pastors should live. We should enter into the pain of our people, even when they are suffering what they deserve. The book of Lamentations features more than one voice, more than one literary character. First, there is the narrator himself, the poet Jeremiah the prophet. Secondly, there is the daughter of Zion, Lady Zion, you could call her, the personification of Jerusalem. The narrator poet begins the book by saying, "How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow she has become, she who was great among the nations. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a slave. She weeps bitterly in the night." Later in chapter 1, that weeping woman, that former princess who's now a slave, who's now a war crime survivor, she somehow finds the courage to speak. She, Lady Zion, the daughter of Jerusalem, she speaks up in verse 12 and asks, "Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought upon me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of His fierce anger. Is it nothing to you?" she asks. She's asking you. She's asking me because, like the priest and the Levite in Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, most of us are just walking on by. She's getting what she deserves. Not going to do anything for her. We've heard the cliche, "But for the grace of God, there go I." But we don't quite believe it. We somehow convince ourselves that we are made of better stuff. Is it nothing to you? Lady Zion asks us, while we as individuals walk on by, while we as an entire faith community walk on by, while we as the church walk on by. We callously choose to interpret every tragedy exclusively in political and economic terms. Those people on my TV screen are complaining about a man who was shot dead by the police, but if you look into that story, that man was not innocent at all. He was a drug dealer. Do you want me to have empathy for a drug dealer? What do you think I am? Some kind of neo-Marxist? Do you believe in critical race theory or something? You see, we have this habit, this tendency to analyze life exclusively in political and sociological terms. But what about looking at people biblically, theologically, missionally? Is it nothing to you? Asks Lady Zion as we walk by, as we explain her situation in political terms, as we ignore her because she's just getting what she deserves. This is where the church can be so refreshingly different than the culture. Our culture, the non-Christian culture, is so intolerant. One strike and you're out. If someone commits a sin that happens to be on the short list of the elite people in power, such a sinner, by their account, is permanently shunned. But as ambassadors of Christ, as ministers of reconciliation, we, the church, are the forgiveness people. Without being antinomians, we are the people who celebrate the gospel. Our sins, they are many. His mercy is more. Take another look at Lady Zion's words there in chapter 1, verse 12. She implies that her sorrow upon sorrow is the worst sorrow imaginable. Is there any sorrow like my sorrow? She asks. It's a rhetorical question. She doesn't want us to analyze her sorrow and tell her no, that other people have suffered worse because they have suffered innocently while she is suffering for her own sins. Is there any sorrow like my sorrow? That question is her way of saying that she cannot imagine anything worse. The appropriate thing to do when you are walking alongside such a sister is to say, there is no sorrow of mine that is like your sorrow. I can barely imagine what you are going through, but I'm going to pray for you every day, and I'm going to stick with you. I'm not going to abandon you by God's grace. And then later, when she is ready to hear more, you can say, there actually is a sorrow like your sorrow. Let me tell you about Jesus, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. He knows you by name. He thought of you when he stood outside Jerusalem and said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." Jesus is not in fantasy land. He's not in la la land. He states plainly that Jerusalem is guilty of murder. You stoned the prophets to death. Jesus is very honest about reality. And yet, Jerusalem is still the object of his love. How often I would have gathered you. Jesus knew that in 40 years' time, Jerusalem was going to become a bloodbath. The atrocities committed in her by the Babylonian army back in 586 BC were going to be doubled when the Roman legionaries came to the city in 70 AD. But Jesus does not just say, well, you'll be getting what you deserve. He calls out their guilt, but he also grieves. He also laments. This is the heart of God. He takes no pleasure in the destruction of the wicked. And as his children, neither should we take pleasure in the downfall of the wicked. What is most remarkable about Lady Zion's lament in chapter 1 is that she recognizes that her ultimate conflict is not with Babylon, her physical human enemy. It's not with Edom, her next-door human neighbor. It's not with some enemy out there. Her ultimate conflict is not even with herself in here. It's not with this faction of Hebrews within her walls, or with her corrupt king, Zedekiah, or with the priests, or with the many false prophets. Ultimately, Lady Zion's primary conflict is with the Lord. The very first time God is mentioned in the book of Lamentations, the very first time Yahweh's name pops up, the narrator poet is speaking in chapter 1, verse 5, where he says, "Her enemies prosper because the Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions." Jeremiah knows that Jerusalem has physical human enemies who have attacked her. And he knows that Jerusalem is not innocent, that she is under attack because of her many sins. But Jeremiah's theology recognizes the sovereignty of God over all things in life, not merely the good things in life, because Jeremiah knows that God's providence is comprehensive, that God ordains everything that comes to pass while still truly and mysteriously not being the author of evil. Because Jeremiah knows that, he is able to say in verse 5, her enemies prosper because the Lord has afflicted her. Ultimately, Lady Zion's misery is not merely the natural consequence of her own deeds, as if she is getting paid back by the impersonal force of cosmic karma or something like that. Ultimately, Lady Zion's tragedy is an affliction from the Lord. And it's not just Jeremiah saying so. Lady Zion herself says so. After calling out to the Lord by name in verse 9 and 11, "Look, O Lord, and see, for I am despised." Lady Zion admits in verse 12 that her sorrow upon sorrow was brought upon her by the Lord in the day of His fierce anger. Now, if the people in your church, if they know any verse in Lamentations, the verse they probably know is chapter 3, 22 and 23. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Do we get to thinking that God's mercy is there for people who deserve it? For people who are innocent? For people who have cleaned themselves up? For people who have positioned themselves to be worthy of His grace? Not at all. The whole idea of mercy and grace, by definition, is that it is given to people who deserve the opposite. The greatest statement in the Bible concerning God's mercy and faithfulness, being new every morning, comes to us in the middle of the book of Lamentations, a book dedicated to exploring what it is like to suffer for your own sins. What it's like to suffer to get what you deserve, but to call out to God in the middle of your grief anyways, believing that the gospel is good news, not merely to people who are good, but to despicable people like us. Consider the structure of the 5 chapters of Lamentations. Chapters 1 and 2 are acrostic poems. They each have 22 verses matching up with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The 22 verses made up of 3 poetic lines. Each verse starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet, giving the reader the sense that this lament is exhaustive. The poet is using the entire language to express his grief, and yet his language cannot do it justice. When you get to chapter 3, something happens in the structure. You'll notice that there are not 22 verses this time, there are 66. The verses now carry not 3 poetic lines, but just 1 poetic line each, and 3 in a row are given to each letter of the alphabet. So verse 1 starts with Aleph, verse 2 starts with Aleph, verse 3 starts with Aleph, Verse 4 starts with bet, and so forth. The poetic effect is one of intensity. The point is that the book is carefully, thoughtfully structured. So we should take its structure seriously because it's giving us clues concerning the message of the book. When we look for such clues, we cannot ignore that in chapter 3, the central chapter of the book, in the center of chapter 3, the pivotal center of the entire book, we find these words in verses 31 to 33. For the Lord will not cast us off forever, but though He cause grief, He will have compassion according to the abundance of His steadfast love. For He does not afflict from His heart or grieve the children of men. The Lord does not afflict from His heart. That is huge. The Lord afflicts. Make no mistake about that. His sovereignty is comprehensive, pertaining to all of life. He has ordained whatsoever comes to pass, but He does not afflict from His heart. It is not as if one attribute of God is more central than His other attributes, as if love is closer to the heart of God than holiness or justice. No, not at all. The Bible teaches the simplicity of God, that God does not have parts. Each of God's attributes entails the other attributes. So God's love is a holy and just love. But what verse 33 is getting at, what the central pivotal point of the book is getting at, is that God's heart, His purpose in bringing suffering into your life, is not aimed at your destruction, Lady Zion. God's heart is aimed at restoration for you. In other words, though His judgment is punitive, though it is punishing, ultimately it is designed to be disciplinary, to be preparative, preparing you to be rebuilt, restored, revived, and reborn. And yet, this climax of the book, occurring in the very center of the book, is followed afterwards by chapters 4 and 5. After this newfound appreciation for God's mercy and faithfulness, after that, in chapter 3, we go into chapters 4 and 5 again, and we are re-immersed in full-on lament once again. Just because we know the gospel in chapter 3 doesn't mean that we give up our lament or our pain or that our grief is now over. The gospel isn't magic like that. If you've experienced significant loss, the death of a loved one, the loss of your job or your reputation, then you know that your journey forward is not easy. It requires you to preach the gospel to yourself every day, sometimes for a long time. It turns out that the really good news that God's mercies are new every morning, that news is good news because the consequences of our past sins, they seem to keep haunting us night after night. I have a friend who suffers from PTSD. He served in the U.S. military in Iraq, and he participated in horrific events. He is one of the most Christ-centered, gospel-centered people that I know. But he also finds it difficult to just get on with his life. For some people, living in the already and not yet involves daily grief. We may receive Lamentations chapter 3. We may receive an epiphany now and then. But later that night, we are unable to sleep as the nightmares of chapter 4 and 5 overtake us again. God knows all about this, and He has breathed out His inerrant word, giving us a book of Lamentations that speaks to the reality of our suffering, how a little gospel message just doesn't make the pain go away. If all we ever do is preach the happy verses in the middle of the book, we give people the wrong idea. They are left thinking that the Christian life is all about moving on, moving beyond grief, and being happy on a higher plane of chapter 3 living. But really the Christian life is about taking the gospel of chapter 3, the glory of chapter 3, God's mercies new every morning. It's about taking those chapter 3 realities with us back into the suffering of chapter 4 and chapter 5 as we descend again into the journey in the shadow of death. I've been maintaining here that unlike the book of Job, which focuses on the suffering of the innocent, Lamentations focuses on the suffering of the sinner. But if you press further into the details of the text, you'll see that the blunt instrument of God's judgment, the Babylonian army that invaded Jerusalem, was an instrument in God's hand, but it was a blunt instrument. It punished not merely the sinful adults, but also the innocent children. In chapter 1, verse 4, it is not merely the corrupt priests who are grieving, it is the virgin daughters who have been dragged away. In verse 5, it is not merely the parents, but the children who have been taken captive. In chapter 2, verse 19, we see children fainting with hunger at the head of every street. And I want you to think about the many children alive today living on the city streets of the great cities of this world, living in extreme poverty in the back alleys of some of the world's largest cities. Perhaps you know a man who is in prison, serving his time for his crimes. But his children, they are growing up without a father. Their mother works 2 jobs. The kids suffer abuse and neglect. And it wasn't their fault. The adult father is being punished for his crimes, but innocent family members are suffering as well. And we see in chapter 4, it pictures the tongue of the nursing infant sticking to the roof of its mouth for thirst. Lamentations, how does it respond to this suffering of the innocent children? Not with bitterness. Instead, the author of Lamentations leads his community in repentance. Chapter 3, verse 40. Let us test and examine our ways and return to the Lord. Finally, let's consider how the book ends. In chapter 5, verse 19, the poet narrator acknowledges the kingship of Yahweh. You, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. He says this in spite of the fact that the earthly throne of the Davidic dynasty has been removed. Then the author asks, why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so many days? Can you hear this question as it is echoed in Revelation chapter 6 when the saints under the altar cry out, how long, O Lord? And then the poet of Lamentations humbly asks the Lord to restore His people. Unless, he says, unless you have utterly rejected us and you remain exceedingly angry with us forever. That's how the book ends. Not with an affirmation of faith, but with an expression of doubt. The author believes, but he needs help in his unbelief. What a wonderful book to preach. It's right there where people live. I believe, help my unbelief. I preached through the book of Lamentations a few years ago because a dear friend of our church had just died in his early 40s, and we were all in shock. The average adult in my congregation was a senior citizen over the age of 65, and it seemed that every month or so, someone was being laid to rest in the grave. We were in a season when we were having more funerals than baptisms. For an academic take on the book of Lamentations, I read Robin Perry's Two Horizons commentary. Perry explains what a difference it makes to read Lamentations this side of the resurrection of Jesus. How to read Lamentations with a hermeneutic of hope. Now, some people think that the Christian gospel trivializes the pain of the world, that we are a bunch of naive optimists who try to erase pain by glibly talking about the resurrection. But Perry rightly insists that having hope while reading Lamentations does not trivialize the suffering any more than the resurrection itself trivializes the cross. And then to get a more pastoral take on Lamentations, I read Christopher Wright's The Bible Speaks Today commentary. Wright's commentary is pure gold. He helps you see how preaching Lamentations involves a prophetic call to live missionally, to embrace a Christ-centered ethic, a Christian way of life in which you identify with those who are mourning, in which you enter into their pain without committing their sin. You take their burdens upon yourself when you pray with them and for them. You walk with them through the valley, even as Jeremiah did with Judah. And you do this knowing that ultimately Jesus has defeated the evil that is behind all the injustice in the world. Lamentations will move you to pray passionately for people who are under judgment. It will move you to bring the pain of the sinful world to God in prayer. Just like John Hartley helped me see that the book of Job prepares you to read Isaiah chapter 53, so Christopher Wright helped me see the connections between Lamentations and Isaiah 53. The difference, of course, being that the suffering servant in Isaiah suffers not for his own sin, but redemptively for you and me. Let me just close with a quotation from Christopher Wright's commentary. He says, Jesus not only wept like Lady Zion wept over Jerusalem, like her, he also suffered desertion by his friends, mockery from his enemies, and apathy from passers-by. Like her, he was stripped, naked, publicly exposed, and humiliated, with none to comfort. Like her, he suffered all this at the hands of an implacable foreign enemy wielding idolatrous imperial power through blood and brutality. Was there indeed any suffering like his that the Lord laid on him in the day of his fierce anger? Like her, he became unclean, defiled by sin that was not his own, but because God made him to be sin for us.